Okay, so good afternoon or good morning. My name is Julia Bislav, and I'm going to be presenting my final year project, which is done in Ain Dara. So the title of my project is Ain Dara's Hidden Potential, the Quarry Park. A brief introduction to the project. So Ain Dara is situated in the Shuf region at approximately 30 kilometers from Beirut, and despite being located within the Shuf Biosphere Reserve buffer zone, the quarrying activity has been affecting the village since the end of the Civil War. So starting from 2009, these quarries, which are 17 by the way, only within Ain Dara, they have started to shut down. However, they have left the village to deal with significant ecological damages and an overall change in its landscape, character, and identity. So my research and design proposal basically emphasizes the necessity of a landscape intervention that aims at proposing water management techniques as well as vegetation techniques to trigger a rehabilitation process within a landscape ecological context. So I basically started off by looking at the quarry activity that happens within Lebanon itself. So the following map is according to a survey done by Antoine Atalla in 2018, and it basically shows how a vast majority of the quarries within Lebanon contradict NPMPLT recommendations, one of those which are in Ain Dara. So Ain Dara is the black circle on the map, and as you can see, it's in red. So the quarries within Ain Dara are all illegal. It's basically. I also realized that basically almost all of the quarries within Lebanon are on arable lands or fertile lands, or on grasslands. And the violations of quarries are basically almost all the same. So they either extend outside licensed areas, they don't respect the stages of licensure, or their faces exceed allowable heights, all of which apply to Ain Dara. Okay, so within Ain Dara, we basically have two different types of quarries. We have the sand quarries and the stone quarries. And so the first problematic of these quarries is their expansion, their uncontrolled expansion. So I plotted them from 2005 till 2016 and realized that they have both doubled in size. The second problematic is that they're disturbing the natural landform. So as you can see in the sections and from the image, these quarries are basically cutting natural landforms or hills or mountains. Although all that I've been saying so far is negative, we also do have potentials. So some of the potentials are shown in these images. The first one is the revegetation potential. So this is actually occurring within the sand quarries, and you can see that you have shrubs growing out again. The second one is water accumulation, which is happening within stone quarries. And the third is the geological strata, which can be an aesthetic value to the area. And these are basically also shown in the opportunities diagram. Now, some additions that I added to this opportunities diagram is that we have basically two very important ecological hubs, which are directly linked to the quarries. The first one is the Shuf Biosphere Reserve of Ain Halta, and the second one is the Ami wetlands. And as you can see, you have direct connections to one of the quarries, which is the one that I'm going to be working on. And second of all, you also have these zones. So you have the core zone, buffer zone, and developmental zone of the Shuf Biosphere Reserve, which these quarries tend to be within. Some constraints of the site, of the quarry actually, is basically that they have been deteriorating overall ecosystems, leading to patchiness of ecosystems, basically. You also have water loss due to stone quarry pollution and loss of biodiversity and groundwater contamination. So that's basically a summary of my analysis. I also created a matrix, and based on this matrix, I categorized different layers that I should be tackling in order to choose my site. And based on these categories, which are, for example, proximity to the nearest route, accessibility, the size of the quarry in hectares, and so on, I chose quarry number 13. And the following is a sketch that I basically produced on site, showing one of the inspirations that I had. This is from the site, showing how they already have water retention ponds and how these ponds are being used to feed their agriculture. Moving to my design narrative or statement. Okay, so in response to the intensity of human-induced disturbances that we're seeing in the Shuf Biosphere Reserve in the form of quarrying activities, this project aims to create heterogeneous microhabitats through the introduction of water management and vegetation techniques both within as well as around the quarries, triggering a reinterpretation of Ain Dara's overall character. So I have two different visions. One is for the stone, which is mainly about water management, and the second is about how to basically reduce or avoid soil erosion, which is a problem in sand quarries. The concept was creating a system of microecological hubs within Ain Dara's quarries, which would connect the village not only to the Shuf Biosphere Reserve context, but also introduces it to the social, economic, touristic, and ecological benefits of the region. So as you can see, this is basically about connectivity of the quarries, their hubs, and these hubs to the Shuf Biosphere Reserve, as well as to the urban areas, which are in gray circles. As for the strategy, so I basically looked at 4 different layers: the agricultural, the land cover, the hydrological, and accessibility layers. And I ended up with the following. So this design aims to reinterpret Ain Dara's character, which is currently defined by its queries, through the introduction of water resource management, such as constructed wetlands, and vegetative techniques, which aims to satisfy the goal of creating new microhabitats to generate needed heterogeneity within the area. I then plotted the existing conditions of the site of intervention. I located where we have the most water in millimeters, the areas that this water is going to be accumulating within. And I also looked at the amount of rainfall collected per year within stone and the sand quarries, where stone quarries exceeded sand quarries by far. Stone quarries also exceeded sand quarries within a range of pond sizes. And as for the action plan, I wanted just to point out that I would be working on water regulation through topography and creating microhabitats. And then I also looked at water regulation processes not only within stone quarries, but also within sand quarries. However, for stone quarries, I'll be using constructed wetlands and through plastic lining. Okay, so the design statement at a smaller scale is creating a quarry park through the introduction of water management and vegetation techniques within as well as around the quarries, so transforming Ain Dara's overall character from a quarry hub into an ecological hub, linking it to the nearby Shuf Biosphere Reserve and the Amit wetlands. So I looked at the overall context of the area, and my quarry was actually linked to the Shuf Biosphere Reserve as well as the Amit wetlands and to Lebanon's mountain trail, which is in red. And so I basically created greenways based on landform typologies and land cover conditions. And the topologies that I came up with were grassland strips, which were on flat plains, a forest strip, which is on hilly areas, a shrubland strip, and lastly, a wetland strip, which is on the lowest elevations, and they're each directly correlated with the elevation and land cover. I then looked at the habitats within my area of intervention, which is Quarry 13, shown here, and I did the planting palette basically based on each habitat category, and I also correlated each plant with the fauna that it would attract, and they're all basically correlated with the Shuf Biosphere Reserve flora and fauna as well as the Amit area flora and fauna. As for my strategy, I basically have an ecological and a program phasing, where I basically show throughout each phase what would be happening on the ecological as well as the programmatic level. And I also took into consideration the seasonality of the programs, because in the summer you have something and in the winter you have something else. So all of the areas that are in red are active, however the pink is inactive. So just to brief, my project would basically be on these 3 landscape systems. So the social layer, the hydrological layer, and the ecological layer. And it's important to point out that at the hydrological layer, the expected storage that's going to be basically stored is 20,000 meters cubed. Okay, so the following is my plan. And it's correlated diagrams. So I have the proposed zones as well as the seasonality, so how it would look like in the summer versus in the winter where you have more water, and which areas would be accessible or not. These sections are basically schematic sections, which I only produced in order to show how the different elevations would show how the design would work. So how at higher elevations you have most activities, and at lower elevations it's more about the water and the habitats. This is shown in section 2 and 3. So in section 2 and 3 you can basically see how I named each habitat and how we have the fauna and not the flora, sorry, in each habitat listed out. It also helped me figure out how rain gardens would be placed on higher elevations because they allow water percolation, whereas the constructed wetlands are on lower elevations because that's where you have the water stored. And I also typologized the wetlands into two typologies. You have surface and subsurface. Subsurface is basically whenever we have a vertical flow of water, so the rain gardens, which are on higher elevations, and the surface are on lower elevations. And finally, mood images of my design proposals. These are basically different scenes within the area of intervention. And just to break it down, I have it divided into 3 different zones. So zone 1 is the social or commercial zone, and this zone is dynamic, so you don't always have farmers market. You can have festivals or other areas which would be social and for the community mostly. The second zone is the ecological restoration zone, and this is the zone that you come into after being in the Shuf Biosphere Reserve. So you have a direct trail. And this is basically where you have a research hub where they learn about stewardship and so on. And the third zone is basically an ecological or leisure area, so how these people are inhabiting these habitats. It can either be active or passive. So the leisure is active when we have the aquatic playground or meditation spaces where they can basically enter, versus the passive leisure zones where you have like bird watching towers and trails which would limit people's access. I also looked at the seasonality, as you can see in the section here. So as you can see, whenever it's winter or spring, you have water in some of the areas, so the people cannot access these areas, and it's only passive. However, in the summer, they can access these areas, so it's active. And that's all. So thank you for listening.